people into the call. We'll start within 1 minute. So stay on the line. We'll start immediately. Okay. We hope that we don't have too much connection problems, because in the last 10 minutes we have had quite some stress to get everything functioning. It's always happening on these moments, of course. But for the moment it looks quite good. So I think by now we are almost 60 people in the call. I suggest we start while other people are coming in. So welcome to the second webinar on Nature Positive with focus on concrete case studies. My name is Johan Lammerand. I work for Arcadis and I'm leading the work stream on methods within the EU Business and Biodiversity platform. Next slide. Today's agenda is, after a short introduction from my side, we'll have 3 interesting case studies again. First, the case of Vattenfall presented by Josephine Blanc. Then we have 2 case studies presented by Tom Butterworth of WSP, the case of Barrett Homes and the case of Transport for London. And then finally we have Ian Dickey from FTIC, who will present the case of Nuveen Natural Capital, which is more of finance, which is in fact an investor. And then we have some time for Q&A and for a very short wrap up. So in terms of the, maybe next slide. Yes. So yeah, no, sorry. Okay. So I just want to tell you that some housekeeping rules. The webinar will be recorded. You will have the opportunity to ask your questions in the chat. I hope it's functioning this time, because last time we had some problems. We will not take questions during the presentations of the presenters, not even after the presentations. So, but please put them in the chat. We'll check them regularly, and afterwards we have some 10 minutes time to take the most burning questions. So, starting again with a short introduction. So this whole webinar series is about Nature Positive. You know very well that Nature Positive is at this moment a very hot topic. It's based on the Global Goal for Nature, which is a policy put in place in parallel to the United Nations Climate Convention's net zero emissions goal. It was nice to have quite a similar type of Polestar target for biodiversity, or for the broader concept of nature, and this has become the Global Goal for Nature. So it commits governments to be nature positive by 2030 by taking urgent action to halt nature loss now. The baseline of 2020 is also popping up in this concept, and we need to ensure that by 2030 nature is visibly and measurably on the path of recovery, which goes on until 2050. Where in fact the final goal is that all ecosystems should be healthy again. Next slide. So this term, Nature Positive, has gained traction amongst all levels, from governments to companies. It's very popular, it's nice, it's a positive term. However, it is a term that has the risk to be interpreted in 100 different ways. And because there are no rules about what nature positive exactly is, what it exactly means, and definitely for the people who wants to engage on a journey towards nature positive, there is a complete lack of guidance on how to do it, how far to go, and so on. This also creates a risk of greenwashing, of course, and this is something that we all want to avoid. Next slide. So, you know, this picture, so we have a few question marks. How to bend the curve from 2020 to 2030? Now, not at a global level, but really from the perspective of a company, a business, a financial institution that wants to engage on the path towards nature positive. Next slide. With this webinar series, we have the aim just to explore the feasibility of becoming nature positive at an entity level based on a common understanding of what it could mean. And so that's why we have developed a current working definition of nature positive. I will explain within a minute. And by means of concrete case studies and interaction with the audience, we will discuss if this is a reasonable working definition, if we can improve it, and what the challenges are for companies to embark on a journey towards nature positive. We just want to bring the debate on nature positive a few steps forward. We have a final, next slide please. We have a final webinar which takes place at the European Business and Nature Summit in Brussels on the 18th of October, where we will reflect on the findings of this webinar series and where we also have a panel debate. You can find all information on the website of the European Business and Nature Summit. The idea is also to come up with a thematic report afterwards, a thematic report on the broader concept of nature positive. Now, the key questions that we have asked each presenter of a case study to answer is, can my company ever be nature positive, or is that simply impossible given all the preconditions for being nature positive? Or would you as a company rather be fine with adopting a nature positive strategy and walking a journey towards nature positive with the aim to come as nearby as possible? And of course, we need to describe what that means. Next slide, please. So based on a number of academic papers, discussion papers, blogs by experts on the topic, we have come up with this condensed set of principles that we want to test out together with you, together with the case studies, whoever is interested, to hear your feedback with the aim to improve it, to refine it, and to bring this whole debate on nature positive a little bit further forward, and also to facilitate implementation by companies and to give them at least some guidance on what it really means. So we have a number of principles. First on scope, we have principles on the concept of net positive. We have principles on the implementation. We have principles on reporting. Very quickly, because I think you have all received our note with this working definition a few weeks ago. On the scope, it's clear that we are not talking about, not only talking about biodiversity, but about the broader concept of nature, which also includes water, climate, soil. In fact, air should also be included. So it's not only biodiversity. And when we talk about nature positive, when we are consistent in our thinking, that would mean that we also talk about water positive, carbon neutrality, or even carbon positive, land degradation neutrality, and so on. Another thing that is common in all the papers that we reviewed is that all parts of the value chain need to be covered. You cannot just claim to be on a journey towards nature positive and only considering your direct operations. You should also consider upstream, downstream. And of course, it's about your material impacts. It's not about just everything. On the net positive, positive impacts outweigh negative impacts. There's indeed some kind of quantitative element in this whole concept, which means that you need to measure. Positive impacts outweigh negative impacts in each part of the value chain, or maybe in each part of the value chain where you have material impacts. That might be more correct. Another thing that's important is that we are talking about absolute impacts. Absolute impacts compared to a well-defined baseline need to be considered, not the relative impacts compared to the business as usual scenario, because then even relative impacts or better impacts could still be on the line going down. So we talk about absolute impacts going up in the positive sense compared to a baseline. And of course, there are a number of rules. For instance, for biodiversity, you need to apply the ecological equivalency principle and so on. So that's part of the net positive idea. Then about implementation. The mitigation hierarchy is, of course, next slide, please, is key. You should, first of all, start with implementing the whole range of the sequence of the mitigation hierarchy options, meaning first avoid, then reduce, then restore what you have destroyed in the period 2020-2030, offset if needed, but always in combination with so-called proactive measures to achieve certain conservation targets that go beyond your own impact. And this is really about restoring what has been historically destroyed. This is about the line from 2030 to 2050, because otherwise we will never achieve this 2050 goal. So it's more, you have more freedom there to apply a number of measures. It's sometimes called the conservation hierarchy. For some sectors or businesses, this might require a drastic transformation of production processes or even the business model, because it's really about positive, absolute positive impacts in absolute terms, as we just explained. Yeah, if you want to achieve that on a longer term, then it might indeed require transform actions. I don't have to tell you that target setting is key in the whole concept. It should be smart target setting. And we are also advocating for a ratchet commitment target setting, which means that you can start with rather feasible targets to enter the journey, but you oblige yourself, you commit yourself to stretch your ambitions and targets every few years, because you really need to improve all the time, and you really need to get more and more ambitious, because that will be the only way to achieve nature positive. Measurability, of course, is key. Next slide, please. Integrated approach. We talk about different dimensions of nature. It means that when you take actions for one nature component, for instance, carbon neutrality, that you should avoid creating negative impacts on biodiversity, or, for instance, on water, which is a real risk when you consider them in isolation. So the integrated approach is another key characteristic. Another one is that nature positive is not something for the sustainability department alone. It should be embedded in the whole organization and should be explicitly supported by the board. Another very important thing is collaboration. It's extremely difficult to achieve nature positive alone as a company, by your own efforts. You will need to collaborate with others. You can do that at a sector level, and this is a good way to achieve transformational change. And you can also do it at a landscape level, because many impacts are really very locational. And within the landscape, you are not the only actor. There are several actors, and it's only when those actors work together that you can achieve a nature positive situation at the landscape level. One comment about the time part. Everyone is talking all the time about the baseline in 2020 and the net positive in 2030. Maybe we should be a little bit more pragmatic and allow for some flexibility in setting the baseline, as long as you follow at least the other conditions of this working definition, because we are almost 23, and the further we move over time, it will be more and more challenging for companies to reconstruct the baseline in 2020. So it's just a question of pragmatism. So that means, next slide, that we have in fact two ambition levels. First of all, the so-called full nature positive company, meaning fully compliant with the interpretation of this working definition on every level within the company, every part of the value chain, every dimension of nature, or a company having adopted a nature positive strategy, which means on a journey towards nature positive, trying to come as close as possible. Yeah, and in fact, for that journey, we could consider the idea of rewarding those companies who are further on the journey compared to the others, by means of, for instance, the bronze, silver, and gold standard idea that is applied for climate. Why not also for nature positive? And next slide then. On the reporting principles, of course, you need part of the concept and the commitment is that you should also very clearly and transparently report about the baseline that you have taken, the targets that you have set, the progress that you make over time, the actions that you take, as well as the challenges preventing you to go a step further. For instance, to be nature positive in your supply chains can be a major challenge because you simply don't have the data about your sourcing locations. And that's a fair argument. Of course, the action is try to get more information, but at this moment it's extremely difficult. And of course, quantitative information is essential. And yeah, okay, if it's verified and certified by independent third parties, then it's even better. That brings us then to the final slide of my introduction, which is a simple way of reporting that we have elaborated for the sake of these webinars, where we have asked each case study to complete this matrix. You see the value chain above, you see the different nature components on the left, and where each company can say, okay, for us, this seems to be achievable, and for other parts of the matrix, this is maybe achievable, or for other parts, it's not achievable, and why. And you will see from the examples, next slide, please. And this is just an example, but you will see from the case studies how our presenters have fulfilled that job. Okay, that's more than enough for the introduction. Now I would like to give the floor to Josephine Blanc. She's a Director of Environmental Strategic Projects within Vattenfall. Up to you, Josephine.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here and letting us share our journey so far. You can take the next slide in my presentation, and actually the next slide, because that was already introduced. My name is Josephine, working in Vattenfall. And for you who are not familiar with Vattenfall, we are energy company, state-owned Swedish energy company. We're one of Europe's largest producers and retailers of electricity and heat. We have many different customers in different markets and around 19,000 employees approximately. And if you take the next slide, you can see also where our main markets are. And also we have a broad portfolio of different energy sources, and the scope of our energy production is Northern Europe, as I mentioned. And nature is, of course, embedded in our operations. Being an energy company, we have a long experience of handling environmental aspects in our activities, and biodiversity, that I will zoom in to a little bit more in my presentation, is on top of our agenda. And if you take the next slide, we have the question that we've been asked to think a little bit about when preparing this presentation. So do we believe that our company and our sector can be nature positive, or is it simply impossible? And I believe that to be fully nature positive in all parts of our value chain will be extremely challenging. And I also think that nature positive in itself is a very difficult claim to prove, since biodiversity is so difficult to measure. But we are in the same time determined to try and to take step by step and find our way forward. So I would not want to say that it's impossible, but I will elaborate a little bit on the challenges. And as Iucn mentioned in his introduction, nature positive is of course broader than biodiversity, but I will zoom into a little bit on our journey there and come back in the end to the matrix where we see all the other areas as well. And if you take the next next slide, we have to elaborate a little bit on the challenges that we are in as an energy company. And the energy transformation and electrification is the greatest transformation of society since the Industrial Revolution. And we are a central player in this transformation, enabling a fossil-free living. And we have a huge challenge in front of us. We aim, for example, in Vattenfall to have commissioned 4 times as much wind and solar capacity in the grid, solar and wind capacity in 2030 compared to 2020. But there are also urgent need of new capacity in the grid, where we aim to have twice as much electricity distributed in the grid by 2030. and also, of course, challenges when it comes to reducing climate emissions and setting targets, for example. And if you take the next slide, when we look at reaching our climate targets, we know that this will have an impact on nature through the commissioning of, for example, new renewable energy or the investments in the infrastructure that is needed. And all energy production have an impact on nature, and we are handling a lot of different types of challenges. For example, in land use impacts, but also collision risks, barrier effects in the landscape, and also supply chain impacts and dependencies. And to do this in a sustainable way, we need to look at the whole energy system and the production from a holistic perspective to minimize the full footprint, but also make sure that we can enable coexistence between, for example, new renewable energy production and nature. And climate and biodiversity are two crises that are so interconnected, and we need to make sure that the solutions also are interconnected. And if you take the next slide, we looking at biodiversity, we have set a 2030 ambition, where we say that across the company, we have committed to have a biodiversity net positive impact approach to guide our work. And we have committed thereby not only to reduce impacts, but also positively contribute to the implementation of biodiversity enhancing measures. And where we are currently, I would say that we have more adapted the second alternative that you presented, Iucn, in your introduction, sort of a nature or biodiversity positive strategy. And we see this as a journey that we are on, and this is the overarching ambition that points the direction forward. And then we have developed a biodiversity strategy that aims to concretize the steps that we need to take to move towards this 2030 ambition. And here we have defined underlying targets that are more measurable and targeting specific parts of our operations. We do this as a part of our environmental action plan, and we are step by step taking improving our ways to set targets to move towards setting smarter targets also within the biodiversity area, so that we can follow them up easily. And we do this on an annual basis for the biodiversity targets that we have currently in our action plan. And if you take the next slide, looking at our current way of working in our biodiversity strategy and the 2030 ambition, we aim to set a more defined net positive impact target measured from a baseline. But there are a few areas we see must develop in order for us to be able to do this. And first, the first key area that we need in order to succeed is to measure our baseline, including the full value chain. And this is a work that we have started on or done, and I will go into that a bit more in a second. And the second area is also to make sure that we are able to calculate also the positive effects from our different biodiversity projects and measures that we have out in field and out in nature, and connect that to the baseline calculations. And third, we need to use technology, digitalization, automatization better to collect and use and analyze different types of biodiversity data and collect a lot of biodiversity data. And I will go through each of these areas now a little bit more in detail. And if you please take the next slide. It is very important to understand our impacts. It's important that we understand the different types of pressures, for example, land use changes, but resource exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive species, and how these different pressures impact nature in different ways. So impacting our ecosystems, species, but also the ecosystem services that nature provides to us. And this, looking at this image from the science-based target, we see that it really requires a holistic perspective, and also it includes the full value chain scope. And finding a metric to handle this complex interlinkage of different environmental areas and pressures is very challenging. But if you take the next slide, we have done a first calculation of our biodiversity footprint. We used the Global Biodiversity Score tool and have done a first value chain, full value chain assessment, including all these pressures. And we have used the results from this assessment to make prioritization, where to put efforts and areas for target setting to also feed into our work to improve our target setting. And from the result, we see that if we look at how our biodiversity footprint is increasing on a yearly basis, we see that 95% of our impacts comes from greenhouse gas emission, which then, of course, also really emphasize the importance of looking at climate and biodiversity together. And if we look at the other part of our footprint, what we call a static footprint, historical impact, then we have, it's mainly caused by land occupation, and around 30% is due to our own operations, but the rest is in scope 3. So also a huge challenge in this, mainly in the supply chain perspective. And also we calculate our aquatic static footprint. It's caused by the historical convention of rivers because we own a lot of hydropower dams. This is a work that is, the module that is used for our calculation here is still experimental. We've been developing it together, but more work needs to be done in order to get the same accuracy of the results. But there is also a challenge that we have really good methodologies, but they are not, some parts needs to be developed through more road testing also. So that will come over time. And if you go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that among the 3 areas that we need to success, and one thing that we find is really important. Of course, measurability is key, but there are parts of this where we're not fully yet there to capture the complexity of this of the area biodiversity, and in a simple way that works both on a global level but also on site where we do the change, where we do the different measures. That is very challenging, and we see that we have global tools that are on a high level, very good for screening, but currently we find it also difficult sometimes to connect the on-ground actions to the global tools, and that is something that we are continuing to work to find our way forward there, and maybe combining different types of methodologies. And for us also, our operations cover large areas and many sites. We have many properties. So doing ecological field service is very time consuming and resource consuming. And therefore we need pragmatic approaches also, and probably combining different approaches and different level of detailed data in order to get the full view and be able to measure in different ways. And we also need to be humble to the fact that we cannot measure everything. There are more soft values connected to biodiversity that are hard and sometimes impossible to capture in a metric. So that are some of the challenges that we experience in our work. And if you take the next slide, I would like to just highlight from one of the examples of how we work. In our distribution network, we managed 8,600 kilometers of power line corridors in the regional distribution network in Sweden. And just to give a bit of comparison, this is more than the distance between Stockholm and Hong Kong, which is about 8,200 kilometers. So it's a huge area. And what we've done is that because we know that the distribution lines also are sometimes very rich in biodiversity and species, red listed species. So we mapped the whole regional distribution network using GIS, and then narrowed it down a bit, and we visited 1,600 kilometers of power line corridors in field with the help of ecologists and using the Swedish standard for biodiversity service in order to get more information about where we have what we call the biodiversity hotspots. And this has resulted in a more detailed mapping of 250 kilometers of particularly biodiversity-rich areas where we can also implement measures in order to further enhance the conditions for these red-listed endangered species we have found in these areas. And we've set up management plans for all of these biodiversity hotspots, the identified areas, and also set a target that we will implement at least biodiversity enhancing measures in at least 70% of the identified hotspots by 2025. And this example is, for example, to illustrate the regional or the scope of the assessment we need to do, is also a way to set a target, but a target that is based more on evaluating the way we work and to integrate biodiversity in the way we work with the reoccurring clearance in the distribution line. And if you go to the next slide, I just have a few minutes left, so I will go to that quickly. But it's really important that we continue to work with R&D in this to better collect data and to use technology to do this in a smart way. And we need to work together, especially if we look in how to also gather data from the supply chain. If we are going to transform supply chains, we need to do it together. So that's really crucial. And if you take the next slide, I have, together with my colleagues, done a first attempt for a feasibility check, whether it will be possible or impossible to set a nature positive target. So here we have also looked at what we do within climate, water and biodiversity and land and soil. So for climate, we have an improved science-based target in line with the 1.5 degree trajectory. Maybe it should have been maybe achievable because the time scale is a bit different here, but we have a clear roadmap forward and targets so for all scopes. But when it comes to biodiversity, it's we see that it's maybe achievable, especially if we look at the dynamic impacts, and our yearly increasing footprint. But full recovery will of course be difficult because the land is still needed for clean electricity. And also, of course, both for water and biodiversity, we see that there are huge challenges when it comes to transparency and data for supply chain. It's already been mentioned, but here we see that it's a bit extra difficult, again, something where we need to work together. And if you take the next slide, it's just a little bit of a summary from the key takeaways we have so far on our journey. So in terms of the biodiversity area, we've seen that it's been, we see that it's important to define bold ambitions, even if we don't know exactly where the road forward and it feels a bit unknown, but setting a target and then backcasting what do we need to do in order to move here has been successful for us. We've seen that it's also having the net positive impact on biodiversity as a guiding target has led to a lot of new initiatives coming from parts of our operations that might not have the most material impact, but have possibilities to do biodiversity enhancement in different forms and ways, and that has really engaged also employees within our company, and that is important. And strengthen the knowledge, the ecological knowledge for more evidence-based knowledge when it comes to biodiversity, how energy production is impacting different species, etc. will just continue to be very important. So we will continue our investments there. And then also one key success factor is when we find the areas where protection of nature actually becomes a business case, we really have possibilities to change. And for it could be packaging in a way that could attract new customers, or for us making eco-innovation as a part of winning new tenders for wind, for example, and that's also integrated in the work that we do.
Fantastic, Josephine. Thank you very much. Was a very, very inspiring presentation, especially your key takeaways at the end and the matrix that you tried.
Yeah, that was a bit difficult. But
yeah, that's indeed the challenge for these presentations. But it obliges you to think really about what does it really mean, nature positive, and how can we make it true. And we'll see all the time that there are many challenges. It's an easy term, but to bring it in practice, it's really difficult. Thanks again.
Yeah,
thank
again.
You. Now we go to the next speaker, Tom Butterworth. He's head of ecology UK for WSP. And Tom even wants to talk about 2 case studies. But Tom only has 20 minutes time, just like all the other presenters. So Tom, up to you.
Thank you so much, Johan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. What I'm actually going to do is just say something about where we are within the UK on this journey of understanding nature positive, and then talk about 2 examples where companies are moving towards and taking this nature positive journey. And I think all of the companies that I'm working with are in the position of taking that journey, rather than being able to say, yes, they're definitely at the end point of being nature positive. So let's move into the detail of this. The UK Business and Biodiversity Forum, very much like the forum here, are pulling together some ideas about what nature positive looks like, and you'll be delighted to know that of course we're joining up really closely with everything that we've heard today as well, and there's lots of synergy. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So within the UK, we are setting out a set of core principles, none of which will be a surprise. I'm not going to go through these in detail because they do line up incredibly closely with what we're looking at within the European Business and Biodiversity Forum. I think one of the key points that I want to draw out is, yes, addressing across the value chain, yes, key smart targets, yes, reporting, but also one of the things we're looking to do is make sure that we've got a ratcheting process, as described earlier, where we take some actions perhaps on some of the easier things to do, and then we build that over time and expand that into some of the things that are more tricky to do. So, and I have to thank the RSPB for this version of the Nature Positive by 2030 in the UK. That's a UK focused species there. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So what our approach in the UK is going to start looking like is that we set a nature positive plan. And this is really crucial. And this is the piece that you'll see we haven't got in these examples yet, because the examples have come about from work we've done over the last 5-6 years. And now what we're looking to do is set out a nature positive plan for businesses that allows them to clearly set out the steps, report on the delivery of those steps that they're taking towards their smart targets, and then ratchet up that commitment every 3 years. So that's where we're heading within the UK. I think it aligns beautifully with what we're doing in this forum as well, which is both no surprise, but no accident either. Let's move on. So I'm going to first talk about, and if you press on the slide one more, it'll bring up. I'm first going to talk about Barrett Development. So Barrett Development is a business where of house builders. They buy land, acquire land, obtain planning consents, build the quality homes across the UK, and that's supported by a whole team of land design, construction, sales, marketing, and so on. So they are a very significant house builder across the UK, and have been doing quite a lot of work on biodiversity over the last number of years. So I'm just going to touch, this is actually a sort of high level case study, and then I'll go into a bit more detail in the next one, which is Transport for London. One of the things that we really like to see in the work for Nature Positive is working in partnership and drawing in expertise where necessary. So the RSPB there is the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, and they have set up a strategic partnership with the RSPB to help guide and inform their journey towards a positive outcome for nature. They've committed to biodiversity net gain on all the developments, so that means that their direct impacts are looked at through the lens of biodiversity net gain. That is becoming a mandatory requirement in England, but this is it isn't yet. It's still in that journey, and Barrett's create homes across the UK, so in Scotland, Wales and so on, Northern Ireland, and that will be a significant commitment in those places as well. They're also testing a whole range of new approaches, and we've got a really lovely partnership here with the RSPB that's playing out, where they've worked on specific site on Oakfield Village in Kingsbrook, and they've done the RSPB have done extensive though they've helped inform extensive measures to improve habitats within and around the area, and then they've done a whole load of monitoring on the site, and they've shown that through the development process, from it being a greenfield site through to a developed housing estate, they've managed to maintain more or less the same number of bird species, and with the same proportions of breeding as well, which is a fantastic story to tell around actually transforming land and not seeing a negative impact on those key populations. This is obviously, we've got an increase in those urban bird populations and a slight decrease in woodland birds. So there is a shift in which species. So there's a challenge there to how we address that type of shift, but some really nice monitoring on the site, and this includes butterfly numbers as well. Butterfly numbers were relatively low in the first year, but we're expecting those to go up over time as the plants mature. So they're testing these sites. They've also tested some zero carbon housing with their Z House that they've recently won Syria Big Biodiversity Award for in the UK, and they've put that Z House out now for students to live in, so it really is getting tested to the extreme, I think. Alongside that, they're providing new homeowners with a set of resources, web-based resources, to allow them to link up and share good practice, and also they're sharing a whole load of information about what they could do in those gardens. At the moment, they're not putting in place a whole load of wildlife friendly gardening without the homeowners' input. Rather, they're encouraging the homeowners to take that on themselves and providing them with the resources and the links and the expertise to draw that into their own home. That way, the hope is that those that take that up will actually deliver long-term benefits. Now, that, as an example, is a really good set of steps towards a positive outcome for biodiversity. They're obviously looking at carbon as well, as I've mentioned, looking at water in terms of water quality, water quantity, flood risk, and drought as well. But that's all, the water piece is all under existing legislation. And I think there is further steps that could be made to look at how their impacts on water then have knock-on effects in terms of biodiversity as well. A lot of that is held through legislation within the UK already. I've already mentioned the impact on land and how that was shaped. We've seen obviously greenfield sites being transformed into housing estates, and there's the interesting story for me there is that we are seeing a positive outcome for biodiversity in many situations where that happens. So I did struggle filling in those that template, the table, and I rebelled and didn't, mainly because this isn't my organisation and I didn't know enough detail behind each of the individual pieces here to draw that in. But I think they're making good steps on each of those parts of the journey, with I guess a challenge to how we measure change in terms of some of these in the water and the land-based assessments, because obviously we've got an increase in developed area, but that doesn't necessarily mean a decrease in the value of that land for biodiversity and soils. Let's move on to the next example. If we can move on a slide. So this is Transport for London now. So Transport for London, very different organisation. They manage the transport system across London. I think 55% of the underground is actually overground. So it's actually quite a significant estate with 9,300 buses operating in their fleet and 402 kilometers of underground, so really large set of infrastructure that they manage with quite a sizable green estate. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So first of all, we set out a baseline. So within I should say with Barrett's, their baseline will be when they buy a piece of land, they'll then run a baseline assessment on that biodiversity and then deliver a net gain against that baseline. So having a standard baseline in 2020 doesn't make a huge amount of sense for Barrett's because they're buying and selling land and buying and selling houses constantly. So having a standard set baseline doesn't really follow. It needs to be something that's based on how their operating model works. For Transport for London, we have been able to set a standard baseline because although they are buying and selling land, there's much more stability in the land that they own. We worked with them to use remote sensing techniques because, as was said previously, sending out a whole load of people to survey these sites is massively time-consuming, costly, but also in some places not particularly safe if you're right at the edge of a train line. So we used remote sensing techniques to gather the information for the habitats. We mapped that and then off the back of that, they set a biodiversity net gain requirement on all of their developments, providing training for their staff and their partners. So this was done with the London, Greater London Authority, all of the local planning authorities, and we engaged with others as well, NGOs and others as well. That allowed us to codify this system of delivering biodiversity net gain across their estate within the business models that they have. So this isn't something that's done separately. This is a core part of their business. And then off the back of that, and using similar data with the speaker that's coming up in a moment from Iucn from FTech, we ran a natural capital assessment across their whole estate. That started to look at the impacts that the environment can have on obviously their customers and the people that are living in and around their estate. So not necessarily specifically around the downstream piece for biodiversity, but certainly very important in terms of understanding the benefits that nature is having on the people in London. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So off the back of this, they're developing a green infrastructure strategy and this biodiversity net gain strategy for the whole estate, building in things like sustainable urban drainage and using their land to help improve water quality as well. A lot of their green spaces aren't necessarily the highest quality for biodiversity. And so what they're looking to do is not only enhance those for biodiversity, but also think about how they can have knock-on effects to improving water quality, air quality, screening from noise and so on. So starting to think about how this starts to have a positive impact downstream, as it were. That hasn't been measured yet. So again, I haven't filled in that table. That downstream piece about the downstream impacts on nature, biodiversity, land, water and air hasn't been sort of quantified in the way for the impacts on biodiversity. And so it's very early days yet. Most of this work is on the direct impacts. We also looked at looking upstream, and their carbon assessment certainly looks upstream as well. We haven't been able to do that for the biodiversity yet. That I think is a future step to look at in terms of their supply chains. So all of this data, the last thing I think on this slide I wanted to just draw out is that all of this data is then embedded in and sent to the local record centre. And what that means is it's called Giggle. What that means is it's publicly available. So all of this is publicly available for scrutiny and reporting. Next slide, please. So in terms of how this sits within the nature positive journey, they are looking at their direct impacts on carbon and biodiversity. We're also looking at the following those principles of the mitigation hierarchy and making sure that this is joined up with partners, and all of this information is publicly available with a single baseline, although that baseline does shift a little bit as they buy and sell land. So meeting a lot of the criteria that we're looking for a nature positive journey, but still very much on the path towards that rather than at the end point. We haven't got there in terms of looking at the upstream impacts at all yet. Okay, my last slide I think was just to flag that this is integrated into their environment plan and into the corporate decision making within the business, which I think is really crucial. Okay, thank you. Last slide. Just reinforces the point that the next steps are really to think about how we expand this out into the nature positive journey as a whole, setting that nature positive plan, setting smart targets within that plan and reporting on those, and then building that out from there. So thank you very much. That's my couple of case studies, and look forward to hearing the next. I'll pass back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Tom. Two great case studies again. I will ask you one very short question by exception. You talk about costed targets on your slides. Does it mean that companies have to monetize or quantify, calculate the costs of their actions?
Yes, that's the ambition,
Okay.
that they understand the costs of their actions,
Okay.
so that they can build that into their business plan. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you for this addition. Great. Two other examples of companies who are doing really well, mainly with regard to biodiversity, but thanks also for making, at least trying to make the connection with a few other nature components. Thanks again, Tom. We now have the final speaker, which is Iucn Dickey from FTech. He's a director within FTech. And Iucn brings us a case of an investor, something completely different. Iucn, up to you. Do we have Iucn? Iucn, maybe you are on mute because we don't hear you. Okay.
Iucn, I don't see him in the list currently, but I can drop him a line.
Yeah, okay, that's that would be quite unfortunate and not to have Iucn here today. And for us, of course, it's not so easy to present the case. In the meantime, and people are free to use the chat to ask questions, because I can imagine there are quite some questions also from the audience on the whole topic and the particular case studies.
Yeah, actually, there came a few questions in that we could clarify maybe in the meantime while we wait for Iucn. So there are a few questions on the concept of nature positive and the working definition. So do you want to address those, Iucn?
Yes, I just started with addressing the questions, Janne. So there is a question from Boy Rodermond from ING about the scope and in particular water. So if we talk about water in the scope of nature positive, what does it mean exactly? Is it only about water quantity, or is it more than that? So it's a good question. The topic of being water positive needs discussion too, I must say. I was in touch recently with a guy from WWF who did really some in-depth thinking about being what it would mean to be water positive as a company, but they are not very much in favor of the term because the term very much refers to counting drops, which means it's a very quantitative approach that companies are just counting what they are using and try to replenish the water sources with the same quantity or a bit more than they are using. But water is a much more complex issue than only water quantity. It's like biodiversity. There are many dimensions on water. For instance, water quality is a very important aspect that seems to be overlooked in that case. And yeah, there are also issues such as floods and droughts and these things. So this is all not very clear in the water positive concept. So that's another challenge for companies trying to become positive in the field of water. So I hope that clarifies a little bit your question, Boy. Then there was a question or a comment maybe from Kat Taylor about this land degradation neutrality and why not talking about restoration. Yes, it's indeed a very relevant remark. We are struggling a little bit with how to phrase this land component. We could also maybe talk about zero deforestation or zero land conversion, because these terms are maybe more often used. Or when you look at it from the positive side, we could even talk about restoration, land restoration. But then, yeah, and then it's part of this proactive action plan to restore what has been historically damaged. So yeah, thank you for the comment, Kat. It's definitely something to modify in the working definition. Yeah, then there's a question from Jasper Vink. When we think about implementing initiatives to become nature positive, do these need to be within a company's own value chain? Or is there a role for offsetting of nature impacts beyond the value chain in other ecoregions where a large impact can be made? Yes, the answer, to my opinion, is definitely yes. You can go beyond your own value chain, especially for this second part of the action plan, which is about proactive measures to restore what has been historically damaged. And so after applying the mitigation hierarchy is definitely something that you should apply within your own value chain, I would say, as far as possible. Then there is room to take additional actions outside your value chain and to contribute to large nature restoration actions, yeah, wherever they take place. Of course, I would say try to keep a connection with your company activities. And then there was a question from Marie-Hélène Ricci from Solvay. How do you compare or integrate the standards of nature-based solutions developed by Iucn with the concept of nature positive? Yes, I think first of all, the standards of nature, the concept of nature-based solutions on its own is a very broad concept, because in the definition of Iucn, it's not only about green infrastructure measures that are being applied as an alternative to gray infrastructure by companies. For instance, replace a concrete dike by a natural grassland that can be flooded as a way to mitigate flood risk. But it's even about large-scale restoration. This is also part of the definition, the Iucn definition of nature-based solutions. So in that sense, the actions that you take as a company to go on a path towards nature positive are absolutely fitting within the nature positive concept, I would say. I go on. There are a few other questions. I heard mentioning of one concrete biodiversity measure, the number of birds species. Have you used other concrete metrics for biodiversity ecosystem services? This is a very broad question, but I can also maybe give the floor to other to my co-presenters of today if they want to jump in, because I see Tom's face appearing, which probably means that Tom also wants to come in. So in terms of the metrics for biodiversity, this is indeed an area where we have provided another webinar series on. There are, of course, many metrics for biodiversity. You can indeed count species, but you can also rely on metrics which are more used in the context of modeling, like the mean species abundance that was mentioned by Josephine. You can also rely on, for instance, the endangered species or the risk of species extinction, which is then more used, for instance, in the STAR approach, and the species, what is it again? Species. I forgot the acronym. I'm sorry, but it's a tool developed by Iucn, mainly focused on endangered species and how you can take actions to restore. I'm so happy that I see Ian's face appearing. I don't know what happened, but Ian, let me stop answering the questions in the chat. There are a few more. We'll try to come back on those questions when we have more time. But I'm very happy to give you the floor for presenting your case, Ian. Up to you.
You're still muted.
Sorry, yeah, thank you very much, Johan. And yeah, apologies, you were wondering where I was. I think I got my timings wrong over to the UK. My excuse is this was, well, it was going to be my 9th meeting of the day. I think it's my 8th. So it was a bit of a heavy schedule, but I'm sorry I missed previous discussions and really pleased to speak to you all. I just check, have I now got control of the screen to move this forward? Not yet. So I don't know if someone's going to do that for me, but I'll start by just quickly with some introductions of the context of the work. Yeah, so I'll talk quickly about FTech and Nuveen Natural Capital. One of the businesses we're doing this type of work for, and then the natural capital accounting approach, and obviously its links to nature positive being the key issue for discussion. So my name is Ian Dickey. I'm a director of FTech. Just quickly on the next slide, there's some data about the business. We're 30 years old this year. I've been working as an environmental economist in the UK and Europe and sometimes globally for the last 20 years. And we've done a lot of work on natural capital accounting, including leading development of the British standard on natural capital accounting for organisations and contributing to national efforts under the sort of SEA ecosystem accounting process led by the UN, amongst many other things. So then, yeah, just quickly background on Nuveen Natural Capital. And they, as we've seen a pattern in the UK, with the development of natural capital accounting in organisations that have a longer time horizon of management, and often in regulated sectors will Nuveen have that longer time horizon characteristic about them, coming out into being as an investment manager for to hold assets long term for teachers. So and as you can see, they're a very substantial business. So then on the next slide, I'll just give a quick description of how natural capital accounting works and then how we build up information within it. So you can think of it as kind of a sequence of answers to 5 questions which build these components down the left-hand side of the screen. So firstly, you've got to ask, what have you got? And you have a natural capital asset register, which gives an idea of the types of habitats and the benefits they can provide. Then you ask yourself, what does this produce in terms of benefits? And you get this statement of physical flows, which is the physical quantification of a range of ecosystem services. And I'll assume most people here are kind of familiar with ecosystem services language. Once you've measured those things in physical terms, you can start to put a monetary value on them. Then a very important step is also to think about maintenance costs in the next line. So as well as thinking about the benefits we get from natural capital, we're also thinking about what do we spend to manage it, to look after it. And that's really important because we can't assume, particularly in the context of climate change, that the natural environment is going to provide us with benefits into the future the way it does now. And we know about various trends of degradation. So are we putting enough resources in to look after the assets to get the benefits in the future? And that's just a good asset management question to ask about any type of asset, but particularly important with natural capital assets that are potentially renewable. and also often their values unseen, as we know in traditional financial accounting. And then you can obviously compare these costs and benefits, but you might find that the benefits are significantly greater than the costs, you might that ratio might be because you're not investing enough to maintain them in the long term. So you have to be very careful with your assumptions about these things. But anyway, you get these comparisons of costs and benefits, and it always raises interesting questions about management for the organization managing the assets. Okay, and then how does this process relate to generating information for investors, for companies around nature positive? Well, we've run some pilots with different investors, and Iucn with one of their properties in Brazil. Some of this information was published recently in their sustainability report, hence it's in the public domain. And so we're aligning to the British standard, so producing what we call a natural capital statement. So that has a balance sheet of performance of the asset, and also what's equivalent to an income statement, which is an annual assessment of impacts on natural capital. And so for this pilot property, quite a big area of sugarcane production, a leased farm in Brazil, we started with a materiality assessment to ensure we're capturing all the ecosystem services from natural capital assets, and also all the impacts on natural capital. And that's an interesting process in itself, because they already have an asset register of properties, obviously as an investor, but they don't necessarily look at it in context of nature positive. So rather than saying we've got productive land, which obviously produces the commodity of financial value, and kind of other land, we're saying, you know, that other land needs to be properly quantified, classified as supporting land, and hence you get an asset register that looks like this. And what's interesting here in the context of nature positive is there is a minimum requirement for tropical forest area maintenance within properties in this part of Brazil, but at this property they go well beyond that minimum, and also some interesting wetland habitats being maintained within the context of the property. But you know, without this process, those things were effectively not really visible within the financial accounts or the decision making of the business, and this information helps, this process of accounting helps bring them out. So we could try and measure and value the benefits from the ecosystem, and also estimate with them the costs of maintaining the natural capital assets. And so we got to a balance sheet, which I think is on the next slide. And you'll see here that we've divided the values. So down the left, there's the asset values. There's then some non-monetized values, because we can't measure everything in monetary terms. And then also those liabilities, which are the maintenance costs I was talking about. And you'll also see in the columns that we can divide out the value of who's benefiting in different ways. And particularly it's interesting to see the value to society being very large, but society doesn't contribute anything to the management liabilities. But those values to society are, you know, potentially an opportunity. If they can enhance carbon sequestration, they might sell carbon credits, but also an interesting area of value added to communicate either to investors in the property or to local communities. And so this gives a different type of picture of the management of natural capital than you would get if you stuck to physical data. And in the details of the account, you look at obviously both data together, but this is one of the ways of subsidizing things. These values are forward looking, so they're calculated over a period of 25 years. So you're looking ahead and saying, if we can sustain the assets that produce these benefits, or we factor in known trends, then this is what the present value of those future benefits are. So you're looking at maintaining the natural capital assets for the renewable benefits they can provide and quantifying those. Okay, I won't go more into natural capital accounting, but there is other information available on it. What we wanted to talk about today was understanding nature positive. So that you can see at the top of the page there, the slide, the statement from Iucn about the purpose of developing natural capital balance sheets with us, and a few observations about that. So nearly half the value is emanating from those values to wider society I was just talking about. I think I've lost a view of the slides, but Yeah, and I mentioned those assumptions about future costs, and it raises a question: are the maintenance costs adequate to deal with future risks? And in this case, the resources committed to maintenance are fairly low relative to the values to wider society. But that's partly sorry, yes, hi.
Yeah, do you want us to present? Yeah, okay, I think we are presenting now.
Yeah,
okay.
I can keep talking to the slides, but it's useful to see them. Yeah, thanks, Johan.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was just talking about those resource maintenance costs. So they're relatively low because the forest is in healthy condition. So there's just a monitoring cost really included in that. And once large enough blocks of forest are healthy, they generally can look after themselves. There are obviously risks to them. But if more maintenance or some restoration activity was needed, obviously that would lead to higher costs. Okay, on the next slide. So just a few things about understanding nature positive. Then with this kind of accounting structure, it gives us a repeatable process of generating this baseline data and then capturing changes in value over time. So that kind of balance sheet can be generated for the hundreds of properties that a business like Iucn has under management and provide comparable data. And that's really important to them to understand how they might manage nature positive outcomes, having a consistent baseline that links together data on management of the environment, the benefits to wider society, and the benefits to the business. Because obviously, you know, commitments to something like nature positive are going to have financial implications to this kind of business. Yeah, and then another thing that was raised in some of the sort of principles that I think need considering around nature positive. So we can combine the sort of data and then see the trade-offs between the management of nature here, values from biodiversity itself, and also from management or maintenance of the habitat. There's an impact on water at this site because it has a large lake boundary, and they manage a buffer zone to that water area to help protect its quality. You can see the carbon implications through the sequestration rate into the forest, but we also factor in emissions from the agricultural operations. And other things that could be captured in the account, like land degradation, and those can all be integrated into this process. And that's really important because I've seen in other processes, you know, different areas of habitats or condition assumptions used in different analyses. So in a carbon calculation, someone says they've got 50 hectares of forest, but in their biodiversity analysis, they've only got 40 hectares. And that kind of inconsistent data isn't going to help decision making. But if you work off a single asset register, then you avoid those kind of silos of data. The data has to be integrated. And if the areas of habitats change, that drives changes in the analysis of the different benefits. So the data is linked together in this system. You can also see, I mentioned there's an above legal minimum level of forest protected at this site that produces a trade-off with production and an interaction with catchment management, and you can see those things reflected in the data. And as a company like Iucn considers expanding forest protected areas or adopting more, I guess, nature positive approaches like regenerative soil management within sites, then you can start to see the effects of those in these accounts and documented in a consistent and comparable way between locations. So I think, like most large businesses, they would say we're just at the start of a journey towards nature positive. We don't necessarily fully understand the destination, but already doing some things to move in that direction and want to understand and measure them better, and then be able to make the case to do more of them. There's obviously a danger in all this that people will be aware of with greenwashing, and the accounting standard I referred to, the British standard, is a sort of major tool to avoid that. So it has requirements, like most standards that are process-based, about explaining exactly why you've done things. So I mentioned that materiality assessment for selecting which benefits and impacts on natural capital are included. And if things are material but aren't measured, they get included in the balance sheet. As I mentioned, that there were listed material unquantified benefits. But what that means is you have to justify which things you're including in an assessment. And for this, we start with the list of benefits that are the services included in the UNCA ecosystem accounting process. It's a relatively short, neat list, and then it can be subdivided into more detailed lists as needed. But what that means is it isn't the business involved or the organization coming up with a list of what it wants to analyze. It's doing it from a structured approach that has a justified starting point. And that means it can't select those things for purposes of greenwashing. And then also having that structured approach starts to support external disclosure. So we're also starting to investigate links between this kind of accounting process and the requirements like the developing TNFD framework, which makes reference to understanding stocks of natural capital to then understand the nature-related data for disclosures. So there are clearly links there that need to be built on and developed further. Okay, yeah, and finally, I tried to sort of summarize some of those things into this matrix. Maybe a bit of of uncertainty in what I've just said reflected in a large amount of yellow. There's a few things that are not yet being measured in the supply chain, and because a lot of the land is tenanted, there's not really any management control or measurement on the downstream use of the resources. So hence that's that red block on the right that could change over time. But there's also some indicators of what's already being done by Nuveen across their portfolio, not just at the pilot site I mentioned, in their direct operations. So they have some measures of things that would help them start to, I guess, set a baseline and track progress and show that they're already making some progress towards nature positive. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions in the remaining time. And yeah, Johan, I hope you found that useful.
Absolutely, Ian. And I think you added a really useful dimension to the discussion of nature positive, which is the accounting approach as an objective way to underpin the quantification, starting from an ecosystem asset register, and then the different the stocks and the flows. And you also touched upon the issue of ecosystem services, and this is also a question: is ecosystem services part of the nature positive debate? It's at this moment when we talk about biodiversity, it's much about habitats and species. But should ecosystem services, so the flows, also taken into account in a nature positive debate? I think so. Your presentation was an excellent addition. Also the fact that that we have a second example here of a financial institution. So thank you for that. And looking to the questions that have been come in the meantime, I think we have some time to handle some of the questions. So I covered already some of the questions while we were waiting for Ian's arrival. So thank you for that, Ian. We already covered some of the questions. But there was a question, I think, to Josephine. Have you been able, from Olivier Share, have you been able to integrate the hotspots mapping results in the GBS footprinting? And if yes, how? Josephine?
Yeah. I would say that yes, it's partly included, but we think that refinements can be done, which is something that we are currently working on. The hotspots are given a different type of classification in the GBS tool, which makes it then visible that these are areas where biodiversity values are higher, but the classification is rather high level, and it is very important to really make sure that these areas are the values of the areas are also highlighted in the model, so that we are and done in an accurate way, because we've seen through our assessments that the power line corridors, it's not only about negative impact, they also are home to the species that belong to the more traditional small-scale agriculture that are now moving into the power line corridor. So that's really important. And we are also, together with a number of other large Swedish companies, involved in a joint development projects to develop a methodology to quantify biodiversity more in projects, a little bit more site-specific. It's building on the DEFRA model in the UK, but being adjusted to Swedish conditions. And the data in this model is based on the same type of standard used for our work in the distribution network, so the Swedish standard for biodiversity service, and that will be interesting also to see how we combine such model with, for example, the GBS tool. So that's that's ongoing work, I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Josephine. Next question comes from Marco Keiser. It seems that some type of tools or metrics currently used to measure pressures for a negative biodiversity impact don't look that compatible with measuring anything nature positive. Will localized observations like field testing be a requirement for nature positive? Or maybe I can say a requirement for nature positive. Nothing at this moment is a requirement for nature positive because, okay, there is no internationally accepted framework for what is nature positive or not. When you refer to field testing or satellite imagery, this is more about data collection techniques, yeah, it's a type of measurement, of course. But in general, I would say that when you measure negative impacts and you measure positive impacts, that you should at least try to use the same metric. Otherwise, it will be difficult to compare negative and positive. I don't know, Tom, you also mentioned something in the chat about metrics, if you want to come in.
I think the question earlier was around the bird data that we were collecting, or it's been collected.
Yep. Go on.
And it was just to say that yes, that was collected, but that's alongside other data sets. So I was reporting on some of the bird information because that's one of the ones that's quite challenging when you transform a piece of land from a farmland into a development. But we also look at the biodiversity net gain, and the metric there is the metric that the UK government's produced that we've already just mentioned, and is being adapted all over the place. We're adapting it in Canada and elsewhere as well. So it seems like a good starting point for a habitat-based assessment, but does need to be complemented by other data sets, especially because it only covers biodiversity and doesn't cover the water, the carbon, etc.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And that links also with the other comment from Jasper Vink about is there a possibility to represent nature positive in one singular metric, or do you need various different metrics that will need to be applied? Yes, the answer is, of course, you will need nature positive exactly due to the fact that it covers water and biodiversity and climate and so on, will of course require the use of many different metrics already within biodiversity, as the discussion is demonstrating now. You will often need to apply several metrics. This is also what Josephine from Vattenfall is just saying. So yes, nature positive will require dashboards of metrics. There is no other way, but the challenge is to make them suitable for communication, of course, but then there is a question for Iucn. Are these accounts done on a per zone site basis? Can they then be combined to give a global natural capital account of Nuveen's assets? Can you do a global corporate natural capital account without going through the per site aspects? Iucn.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So on the benefits side of assessment, kind of yes, you can, and the methods are scalable. So we at FTech have done accounts from the size of a farm of a few hectares up to national accounting methods for the UK using the same methods, the same data sets. Particularly on the benefits side, the organizational accounting method I presented, and there are technical differences, but it's 99% the same thing as the UN SEER in terms of analyzing benefits. So that is devised on the idea that an organization has a kind of spatial management boundary, that it has responsibility for what's within that. That's the starting point. So you can do the account for one site like that. I said a small farm or a larger land holding, and if you've got multiple of those, you can aggregate them together. You would want to do that also for the management costs, and that's where scaling gets difficult. So governments don't add up what money they're spending to maintain natural capital. It might be a good idea if they did, and it would be a good idea if accountants could geolocate all their spending data. tag it with a spatial location, we'd have very rich data about what's spent managing, restoring, damaging the environment. But that doesn't happen at the moment. So that cost side of the corporate account isn't available at larger scales. So when you get to a larger scale, you get something more akin to national accounting. So the scale is limited by how well you can cover the cost side, which tends to be much easier within a single organization and its land holding or multiple holdings.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I think that's a clear answer. So I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So I would like to thank all of you for participating in the webinar. I would like to thank the presenters, of course. I would like to thank the logistical support also for this, Jolien and Janne, for making this webinar again a success. Next week, we have the last case study focused webinar with, again, 3 other interesting case studies. We have a case study of University of Oxford. We have the case study of the cement industry nature positive roadmap. And we have Burberry's going for nature positive. And then there is, of course, the 18th October with the final webinar, which is integrated in the European Business and Nature Summit, where we also have an excellent group of people. So we'll have their Business for Nature in the session about nature positive. Business for Nature will present their paper about nature positive. We'll have the academic view on nature positive by Joe Bull from Oxford University. I will also bring the findings of the webinar series, and then we have a panel debate with representatives of Caring, Veolia, Spadel, and there was one other company, yes, Wienerberger, yes, and also World Economic Forum is participating in the panel debate. So you're all very much welcome, and so thanks again for your attendance, and wishing you a nice day or a nice evening, and see you again next time. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.